All right, everyone, here's our likely the last recording until I come home. The reason being is because at the very end of this lecture, um, there's kind of a concept that I want to run with you together, and it's a calculation, and I don't just want to leave you hanging on that. So, anyways, so we got through these ideas of plate tectonics and why things are spreading the theories behind it and who, came up with those, right? We had Alfred Wegener and Harry Hess, and of course some others that help support that. But then there's this idea of like, why is this happening? And so we're kind of going back to this convective model, right? So heat rises and cold sinks. So, if you've ever been, in a log cabin or gone up to Tahoe or anything like that, and you've been in a house or just any house really, and you go to like an upper level or anything like that, and you can see that heat rises, or even if you've cooked over a stove and you see that steam coming up, that hot steam is rising and billowing over that pot, right? And so we can apply that idea to plate tectonics and plate movement. So hot magma comes up to the surface, it's hot and it rises, and then the sea floor then cools and subsides as it goes away from the ridge. So it's like this really interesting kind of circular motion that goes on here, which is really quite fascinating, right? So like ocean floor or anything that sinks down to the ocean floor will eventually get recycled back into the center of the earth and then perhaps come back to life as magma. And, you can certainly go into some existential crisis spirals when you think about this idea a little bit, but it is quite interesting. And then next up, I want to talk about this idea of the rate of spread. So I alluded to this idea in earlier recordings, but all these plates are moving and thriving and jiving together, but all at different speeds. So what we're looking at here on the right-hand side is what's called a half spreading rate in millimeters per year, where the warmer colors are indicating a faster spread and the cooler colors, or purple colors really, are indicating a slower spread. So if you look at this image, try to locate where there's faster spreading and slower spreading. Have a look. What do you see? Maybe even pause the video for a second and look at this image. Yeah? What's interesting is the average rate is about roughly the same rate as fingernail growth. So maybe you've like clipped your nails too short before, or like ripped a fingernail off accidentally, and you're like, oh my gosh, when is this going to grow back? And then it finally does. That's kind of the average rate of our plate tectonic movement, which is really quite fascinating. In a 75-year human lifespan, that spread is about the length of a car, which is kind of wild, right? That's, you also think like in 75 years, if you just let your fingernails grow, it'd be like the length of a car. Kind of gross to think about, but kind of interesting too. Seems pretty small to us, but really over long geologic time scales, the impacts are quite huge. We went from Pangea to what we see as our world today, which is pretty wild, again, over a course of like millions of years. So hopefully you've had a second to have a look at this, and you notice that there's a much, much, much slower rate of spread in the Atlantic Ocean and a much faster, almost hotspot sort of rate of spread in the Pacific Oceans. And we can get some really interesting geological features from that. I'm going to try to move my face so it's not totally in the way of everything. So with a slower spread, we tend to see these higher sort of peaks and narrower mountain ranges, whereas with a really fast spread, the peaks themselves are much lower, and the width of the mountains is much wider. So it's pretty interesting. And in this map here in the upper right-hand corner, each arrow is indicating a rate of spread, but the length of the arrow matters. So the shorter arrows indicate a slower rate of spread, and the longer arrows indicate a faster rate of spread. This is really just kind of showing the previous image, but just in a different manner. So what's really interesting is if we consider thinking about what the world would look like in about 50 million years, all things staying the same, not considering sea level rise or, any sort of other catastrophic thing that could occur. This is what we think the world would look like, right? So what I want you to think about is what cities would be moving farther apart from each other and which cities would be getting closer together. So if we were to consider, for example, like San Francisco and Hong Kong, do you think they would be moving further apart or closer together? If you thought closer together, you would be correct. Because, those two plates are kind of coming closer together. A little bit easier perhaps to focus on maybe New York City and London. They would be moving further apart from each other. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. I'll try and touch on this when I get back. The last thing that I wanted to kind of touch on, or two last things really, but your book doesn't go through this idea, so I want to make sure that you have a decent understanding of this, is this idea of accreted terrains and accretionary wedges. So basically, the lithosphere and the sediment attached to it moves and attaches to the continent during this process of subduction. So the reason that I want to focus on this idea is because this is, quite frankly, how the west coast of North America was created. It's a pretty cool concept, I think, and I hope that you also agree that it is pretty cool. So the way you can think about it is, going back to this idea of the oceanic plate colliding with the continental plate. Under the water, we can see this sort of accretionary prism, or this kind of squishing of sediment and scraping that happens. So we can see these kind of folds in the ocean floor. And if there was anything attached to this ocean floor over here, like an island or something like that, that would get smashed into this area as well, which is precisely what we see here. So in this top left, we have this inactive volcanic island arc that's attached to this plate that's being subducted under this continental plate here, where we have this more active volcanic arc, and we see this trench off the coast here as well. And over time, this inactive volcanic arc with this movement gets smooshed into the continental plate here, and then further in time, that subduction still occurring, so another trench gets formed, and this active arc becomes active again. What used to be inactive is now active. So if we were to consider the west coast of North America, basically it's all accreted regions, which is really quite fascinating. So pretty much all of Alaska consists of displaced continental fragments, ancient ocean floor, submarine deposits, and an island arc. And you can see that kind of feature all the way down the west coast of North America, California included, pretty much the whole state of California. So that's why I choose to kind of go into this idea. Now, maybe you've thought to yourself, well, yeah, this is all fine and dandy, but we haven't really even touched on the idea of Hawaii, and we're going to get into that now. So Hawaii is considered what we call a hotspot. So basically these are found underneath the continents and oceans near the center of plates and at mid-ocean ridges. There are over 40 hotspots found worldwide, and it's basically like this little burst of magma, almost like a pimple is a really silly way that I like to describe it. It's like the earth is like blip, and then we form an island, but the island keeps moving because the plates are moving, but then the earth is still like blip, and then it's still moving and forms an island, and then but the hotspot stays in the same place. Which is quite fascinating, and this can create these island chains, and the youngest peak is generally found above the hotspot. So if we were to focus in on Hawaii and the Hawaiian chain, this is kind of what we would see. So we have the Mid-White Islands just northwest of Hawaii. If we were to look underwater, and there are some that are still above water, and then we have the islands of Hawaii here, with Kauai being the oldest of the islands and the Big Island Hawaii being the youngest, which is really quite fascinating. And what's kind of cool is there's another seamount chain further north, but still in the Pacific Ocean. And it's likely that these are basically like all a part of the same chain from the same hotspot. Just everyone's been kind of moved around and displaced a little bit, which is quite fascinating. Here's another way to kind of view that. We have Hawaii down here in this Hawaiian Ridge, and then we have the Emperor Sea seamount chain, which connects to the Aleutian Trench and the Coral Trench, which is quite fascinating. Here's an image from your book that basically shows, again, all of that same stuff. But what's kind of cool in this feature here, under or beyond the hotspot, as things start to move away, if the plate is kind of lower, then the islands, or what used to be islands, get kind of submerged back underwater and they sink back into the ocean, and then they can form what are called guyots or seamounts, which are basically like underwater islands but with flatter tops in a sense. So we're going to get into this idea when I return about calculating the rate of spread and calculating hotspots. I'll keep these slides in the slides that I post, but you don't, in case you're like math oriented and really kind of want to tackle this idea without me, which would be totally fine. But if you want to just pump the brakes and hold on until I come back, that is totally fair as well. No big deal on that. So with that, my dear friends, thank you so much for your time and attention and for watching, and I will see you when I return. Thanks.